Hello, and welcome back to the Just Follow Joy podcast. My name's Ariana Joy. I'm your host, and I'm a human design reader and teacher. And today we are joined by my lovely friend and our resident astrologer, Caitlin Goehring, who is an astrologer, not an astrologist. We just had a conversation about how, for the longest time, I thought I was astrologist, and I'm pretty sure the first episode you were ever on. We weren't talking about this earlier, Caitlin, but I'm pretty sure the first episode I had you on for, I called you an astrologist like multiple times. And you were like, yeah, I don't correct people.
So many people think it's astrologist. I'm just like, sure, if that's what you need me to be. But I
That's
think
what you
it
need to
has to
sleep
be
through the
here.
night. That I'm an astrologist. But anyway, today we're talking about something that we both absolutely love and I think is so amazing, which is astrocartography. And actually, the first or second episode that you were ever on, Caitlin, we talked a little bit about astrocartography, but we really didn't dive fully into it. So I think it's something super helpful, especially for someone like me who I love to travel. I being in different places and like feeling the energy of that place is something that's just always been fascinating and interesting for me and important for me. So yeah, let's dive in. So first off, what is astrocartography?
Oh, well, I'm so excited to be diving into it with you. It's something that I love so much too. I like share that love of travel and feeling the energy in different places. And astrocartography is like just such a great combination of astrology and travel and intentionality and like all the ways that these things come together. So I'm stoked to get into it. So what astrocartography is a modality within astrology that was created by this man named Jim Lewis in the 1970s. So it's a fairly new modality within astrology. Yeah.
Wow,
And
I did not know that. And I also didn't expect you to give me the history background, which I am eating up. I love.
oh, good. Okay, yeah, get ready. So, one thing is that Jim Lewis technically trademarked the word astrocartography. So, this is like brought up a lot within the astrology world because, like, nobody else has trademarked any other modality or like frame of reference within astrology. So there's kind of a question around like what are the actual legal scopes of that. So sometimes you'll see astrocartography written as like astro star cart star or carto star graphy, and that's because people are trying to like separate the word and like not have any kind of trademark infringement.
Astro Star, sign, charty, graphy
Yeah,
travel, cartography.
it looks so
Do you
chaotic.
want to throw in anything
I
else?
know, right? Like, is there anything else that we can throw in here to like make this look even less approachable or legitimate to somebody? It's hysterical to me. But anyway, so what astrocartography does, it's creates a map of the world infused with your birth chart, basically. So it's from the premise and idea of relocated astrology, which means that we can create a new chart for you, not an entirely new chart based off of your birth chart, but what it is it's a chart that is adjusted based off of being in a new space. So it's the exact same moment in time that you were born, but as if you were born in a different location. So what your astrocartography chart is it's showing you a map of the entire world, and then it's showing you the different locations where certain planets will be more amplified for you. And so that's happening because that planet is being brought to a different angle within your chart. So it's either going to be activating your rising, your descendant, your IC, or your midheaven. And then that'll give you different nuance as far as like where that energy is really moving through within your life. But what we're looking at with the chart is essentially a map diagram of your relocated chart in a way. And so you can get deeper and see your actual relocated birth chart for those places, but just looking at the map will give you an overview of what's being more activated there. And so this is so useful for literally anything, like whether you're traveling, whether you're moving, but it allows us to really draw forward certain qualities or themes that we're looking for within a new space, as well as be able to differentiate, like, okay, that other space maybe isn't going to be the most supportive for me, or it's going to be more challenging to integrate XYZ, to be more invested within community on a Saturn line versus on a Sun line or on a descendant line, where the focus is so much around other people and our relationships versus Saturn. Typically, we tend to spend more time in isolation or not having the access to the personability or to the connection with other people. So there's so many different ways that we can use the astrocartography chart to determine where you should live, what you want to uplift within your birth chart, maybe different energies you want to amplify or to tone down other energies. That's like a really big way that we can use this. But you can also use it based off of the transits that you're currently going through.
Ooh.
So yeah, so for example, if you're going through a lot of really heavy Mars transits, depending on how Mars is in your chart, you're going to be experiencing that differently. But that might not be a time that you want to travel to your Mars line because it's already so activated. That might be a time that you want to travel closer to your Venus line and bring in more of that energy and kind of create more balance. So there's so much like self sovereignty and authority that we can take within our birth chart by using astrocartography, which is so, so cool.
So amazing. And I was actually just talking with Caitlin. This is such a different topic, but I was just talking with Caitlin about this comedian who was like making all these fucking jokes about like how little self-sovereignty believing in astrology gives you. And like how you basically are saying you don't run your own life if you believe that there are energies around you that are created that you don't control and must live within and learn to adapt to. And it's just so funny because I was like, you're
And you're
incredibly
like,
wrong.
I know that that's not the case.
That's not the
Yeah,
case. And also, he said that Jupiter has rings and Jupiter does not have rings. So we're the idiots. Okay.
first of all, you're so uneducated. Like, tell me you're uneducated in so many ways. Um, Also, like, what's so funny to me about that is like when we're being influenced by subconscious energies, like when we're not conscious of energies that are influencing us, it has more control over us. So
Mm.
actually, by like tuning into your birth chart and knowing where these energies are moving, we're bringing more awareness around it. And by nature of doing that, we have more control and sovereignty over how it comes through and how we're engaging with that energy and like the way that it shows up for us. So anyway, I know that you shared that as like just a joke as an aside and it is hilarious, but I'm also like, we're missing the mark.
Excuse me. But also, wait. So, yeah, and that's so true. And that applies to where we are too, right? This can help us
Yeah.
make such better decisions for ourselves locationally.
There's so much different sense of responsibility that we can take when we use astrocartography, when we connect to places that we live in. I especially have felt this with certain groups of people who feel maybe like disempowered to leave or to make a different decision about where they're living.
Mm.
This is something that feels so empowering to me over like the choice that we have around where we are, but also that's so validating around just like, yeah, your life and who you are will feel different in different parts of the world. Like there's the idea of like wherever you go, there you are. And that's true. If you leave where you are to try to escape something, you're going to bring whatever the thing is with you. But also, there is so much truth to the amount of energy and different themes that you might be engaging with somewhere, and just changing your location can completely shift that experience that you're having.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's funny because when we just like tune in from a human design perspective and from an energetic perspective and intuitively overall, when we tune into how we feel in a place and we really accept that and we're really okay with that, then we'll probably feel this stuff anyway and know when it's time to go and when it's time to stay. But just like human design, which reminds us and brings us back to who we are and how we operate, this can be such a form of validation, which is basically what Caitlin's saying. Like, yeah, well, no fucking wonder you don't feel good here. This is your Saturn line, and where Saturn is in your chart, it's activating this thing that you're really struggling with right now. Can you see that maybe you don't have to be here right now if you have the opportunity to leave? If you don't, different conversation, different things you could do.
Absolutely. It's not accessible for everyone to just be able to like up and leave and go to a different location because where they're experiencing is not pleasurable. And like, I don't think the goal is always just pleasure either. Like, there's so much learning to be gained from being in those spaces. But exactly like you're saying, like, if you're going through a heavy Saturn transit and Saturn is a more challenging placement within your chart, then like, don't be on your Saturn line right now. Like, you don't need to make it harder for yourself and amplify these themes. You can kind of mediate that by being somewhere else and uplifting these other pieces of your chart in order to create more, I don't know, like a better synchronic way that all of it gets to work together and that you get to engage with the energies versus being so focused in one area. And you brought up a really great point, which is that it also really depends on where that planet is in your birth chart. Because, for example, like you and I have opposite moon signs. I'm an Aquarius moon, you're a Leo moon. Me being on a moon sign is going to be really different than you being on a moon sign. They're going to both be moon lines, right? Like they're both carrying a lot of similar themes, but like mine's an Aquarius moon line and yours is a Leo moon line. So just by nature of what those two different signs represent, like the energies and how we experience them are going to come through really differently. So it's so personal. And then we get to look at like, what is the moon doing in your chart? Like what other planets is it making aspect to? Because it's bringing all of that energy in there.
For somebody who is new to this, could you quickly kind of run through what each planetary line would represent?
I would be happy to.
Well, good, because that's why you're here. So do your job.
Thank God. Yeah. So I'll go through all the planets, but one thing that maybe we should go through the angles first because that's also such a strong component of it. And there's only 4 angles versus all of the planets. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
All of the planetary lines will be connected to a different angle. And that's because when you're in that space, it's bringing that planet close to that angle wherever you are. There's also some other things happening in the background that have to do with planetary lines intersecting, which we're not going to get into yet because that's way too convoluted. But in general, we're like really looking at and talking about the angles in the chart. So we have the ascendant, which is your rising. So when we have an ascendant line, regardless of the planet that it is, the focus is really brought towards yourself, your individuation, your identity. We're more self-focused in these areas, but we're learning more about ourselves. We're asserting ourselves more. We're connecting to our physical bodies more. It has more to do with me as individual. The descendant line, which is the opposite, brings the focus around our relationships, our connections, our communities. These are the spaces and the lines where people will meet their spouse, people will meet friends that they have for the next 10, 20, 30 years of their lives, or people will have really important business collaborations, or where they'll be brought opportunities through their connections and through their friendships. So the focus is very much on like that connective piece, me and other people. The IC line, which is the 4th house line, is really connected to home. So sometimes these themes come up around like your lineage and your family, but really these are lines where you're super integrated and focused around your home space, your personal life, your private life. And then we have midheaven lines, which is the opposite of the IC. And so these are lines that are really focused around your career, your external focus, how you're known within the world, how you're contributing, what you're giving back on a larger scale. So those are the general themes around where the planetary lines can come through. So we have all the planets represented within the different lines. We have the sun line. When we're on and around a sun line, it's kind of similar to the ascendant, where the focus is really on like your individuality and how you shine and like how that comes through for you. The angle that it's on is going to give more nuance as far as where you're experiencing that or how you're taking in that learning. But yeah, the sun line is all about your sense of vitality, your sense of individualism, how you shine, how you contribute, what makes you feel good within that, like what enlivens you and how you're contributing to the world around you. When you're on a sun line, typically there's a lot of energy that you'll feel, like you'll physically just have a lot of energy and vitality. You might be doing more things that make you feel good and excited to give back or to contribute in that way. You might also just be developing more awareness around what that looks like for you and like where you're finding that. A moon line is a space where like this is one of the most prime lines when you're looking to settle somewhere or to like really integrate yourself and to build a steady, secure home. The moon line is that feeling of just ease and comfortability, and having that be something that feels like the external world is matching your internal world in some way. So there's a greater ease there. There's also an emphasis around relationships and our connections to people, but with a moon line, this is really around like our intimate relationships and our most personal connections and partnerships, how we're known and seen by other people on a really intimate and emotional level, as well as our own internal world coming more into focus around a moon line. Mercury lines are so wonderful for all types of communication. Really, communication and connecting with people are the biggest themes around Mercury lines. And so sometimes that just looks like relationships and being really active within community and with people and like engaging with a lot of different kinds of people. Sometimes this comes through more in terms of like study or education. What I've seen with a client who was on a Mercury descendant line when she received a book deal that she had been wanting to work on for a long time. And so it can be around these themes of, yeah, education, communication, sharing ideas, teaching, learning is really huge with the Mercury line. Mercury lines are also great if you're wanting to like, I don't know, I've done consultations for people who have wanted to have like a writer's retreat or to take a sabbatical for themselves and to kind of tune into their personal selves, but also see what wants to come through for them within their work. A Mercury line is like so great for all of those pieces. The Venus lines are one of our best lines for creativity, for connection, for relationships, for pleasure. A Venus line is always what I'm looking to put someone on if I'm helping them find a place to retire, assuming Venus is well placed within their own chart, of course. But really, when we're on a Venus line, our focus is so much more around how we can be in harmony with the world around us, with our relationships. Sometimes being on a Venus line is where people are when they meet their spouse. Again, when they're just like needing really deep interconnected relationships. But it's coming much more through like the heart space and through a sense of how can we collaborate and like really meet one another and uplift each other, versus the mercurial connection to people is much more intellectual or mental. Venus lines are also a great space to tune into art and creativity, to tune into aesthetic, to be really focused and engaged on that. And again, maybe that's coming through in your home life, maybe that's coming through in your relationships, or maybe that's something that's being brought up more within your work. And the angle is going to really help determine where that's existing for you or like where that's being amplified. And we have Mars. On a Mars line, we have so much more access to our own energy. So usually on a Mars line, we're super active, we're really engaged. And that might be because we're like personally motivated to be putting these things into place, or it might be because we're in experiences or situations where life is demanding that of us. And again, like that's going to depend on whether it's an AC line, a DC line, etc., like where that's coming through. Other themes within Mars lines can be connecting to your sense of power, your sense of vitality, how you're asserting yourself. You might be confronted with situations in which you need to assert yourself, or you need to connect to this piece of yourself more deeply, or to embody it in a way that you haven't before. Mars lines can also just be kind of conflicting. Sometimes when people live on a Mars line, I've heard experiences where people just have a lot of energy and it feels really good, but then they need to like get out of that city to rest because they're constantly moving, they're constantly doing, they're almost in burnout. I've also
They're like, I'm kicking too much ass.
exactly. I need to like slow down and kick a little bit less for like a week.
I need to give it a soft push with my big toe.
Yeah, and Mars isn't into the soft pushes. Mars is like send it off the cliff, you know?
Mars is like steel-toed boot up
Yeah,
your
exactly.
ass.
No, yeah, exactly. Another theme that can come up with Mars lines is like just the general idea of confrontation and having experiences in your external world that are not necessarily contributing to a sense of harmony. And so depending on what's happening in your life, like this could be really positive energy to tune into. Like, I don't know, I think especially if you're somebody who, let's say, like practices martial arts, being on a Mars line could be so wonderful for you, especially if that's your career. If it's like a Mars MC line, that would be such a wonderful place for you. Whereas for somebody else, it might not feel that way or be as productive. Really, like all of these lines are going to function so differently based off of the planets within your chart, but in
Which we will talk about.
which we will talk about. In particular, though, Mars and Saturn are going to be two of the most polarizing lines, but depending on if you are a day or a night chart, you'll feel it in the opposite. So if you're a night chart, a Mars line is usually going to feel more supportive for you if you're a day chart, and a Saturn line is going to be harder for you. If you have a day chart, then a Saturn line is going to maybe not be easier, but like it's going to feel a little better for you than a Mars line will feel. Then we have Jupiter. So a Jupiter line makes things bigger. bigger. It also brings into consideration themes around spirituality, around learning, teaching, sharing, and distributing knowledge and information. So teaching in general is so prominent within a Jupiter line, learning, diving into new spiritual practices. All of those pieces are huge around a Jupiter line. So Jupiter lines can be a lot of things. Jupiter lines amplify. Typically, a Jupiter line is a really positive place to be. And I know we'll talk about this in a bit, but depending on where it is in your chart, it might not be amplifying something that you want it to amplify. So it's just something to take note of. And this is the same with Venus too. Venus and Jupiter lines, a lot of people, and like if you're just doing basic astrocartography research, a lot of people will say like those are just the best lines. You should just go beyond them. But again, depending on where it is in your chart and what it's activating, it might not be the best place for you to be. Then we have our Saturn lines. Saturn lines are a tricky one because a lot of people will just like automatically want to avoid the Saturn line. But like what you've already mentioned, it doesn't feel bad for everybody. It also like is not a negative thing to be on a Saturn line. On a Saturn line, typically we're asked to put in hard work. We're asked, or we're in a space where we need to invest ourselves, where we need to be disciplined, where we need to be devoted to what it is that we're creating or what we're putting our energy towards on a day-to-day basis. But a Saturn line can be so supportive. For example, people who start businesses on Saturn lines are the kind of people who have businesses that 30, 40 years later are thriving and sustaining them and have been sustained the whole time. So it might be more challenging in the offset of it. It might be the kind of thing where you're on a Saturn line, there's always sacrifice. So maybe it's your personal life that's sacrificed a little bit more heavily, and like you're not connecting to that space as deeply because you're having to invest your time and energy in your studies or in your work or whatever it is that you're building towards. So there's kind of a sense of like, I'm putting in all of this energy and this time, and I'm not necessarily seeing the fruit of the labor yet, but it's Saturn. Saturn wants you to put that in and is not interested in the fruit of your labor coming up tomorrow. It's interested in the long game of like, how rooted is it? How is this actually building and supporting you long term? And so we have so much capacity to access that when we're on a Saturn line. And often people will travel to their Saturn lines when they're in school, when they're starting a business, when they're learning something that's going to be integrated into the work that they're doing for years and years to come within their work. So yeah, it can be a very beautiful space to be, although it's not the easiest space to be.
Yeah, I mean, Saturn's the delayer, right? And not always in a bad way, but because it's the long term. And also, Caitlin, this is kind of what I wanted to talk about with the Saturn line, because we have a really great example of this. But I went to Boston recently, and for the longest time, I was like, I should not go to Boston because my Saturn line, it literally runs smack dab through it, like Dorchester, like right there. And, anybody from Boston is like, that's how dare you? But when I was there, I had the most incredible time. I got a ton of work done. I felt amazing. Like I felt alive, like so happy while I was there. And I mean, part of that, I mean, I have a day chart, like I mentioned, and then also I'm a Cap rising. So I'm like pretty comfortable with Saturnian energy. And then also, what's funny is that you said it's a little bit more like isolating, but Saturn is in the third house for me. And that has to do with a lot with like your family and, you know, your like early age and where you come from. And I was like connecting with family that I haven't seen for like 17 years. And it was great. It was amazing. It was so good to see them. And I know that you were on your Saturn line. Was it in Hawaii?
Yeah. I visited my Saturn line earlier this year. I have a night chart, so Saturn functions very differently for me. It's also in my 11th house. So it's also a community-based house, but more centered around like groups and organizations versus like your local community and neighborhood and people that you're around within your third house. Um, Being on my Saturn line was really interesting. I absolutely loved being there. I did experience so the isolation piece of it was interesting because I wasn't literally isolated and I was around people the entire time, but everything that we tried to do got canceled. So we had like so many different tours and bike rides and things that were planned. And then when we got there, it was because of weather, but like literally every single thing that we had planned was canceled. And so our trip just started from scratch basically. And it ended up being so wonderful, right? Like who cared that everything got canceled and that we got to just figure it out on our own? Like it was better than what we probably would have experienced otherwise. We got to just move with what felt right and where we wanted to be. And I also should mention that the person I was there with had his Jupiter line running through the same island. And so our experiences were so different. And I felt like that opened up a lot more for me. Whereas if I'm just there by myself, I don't know that I would have had those same opportunities open up because it felt very Jupiterian in that way. But I still felt that Saturn sense of like, oh, what you planned and what you thought was going to happen is just like not it. And you're gonna readjust, and like that got pushed off course. But something else that came through so strongly for me when I was there that felt really Saturnian, but also because you and I both have Saturn in Pisces, and so this feels so indicative of Saturn and Pisces to me. Hawaii is a place that's so connected to my dad. He used to travel there all the time for work, and he just absolutely adored the islands. It was his favorite place on the planet. And you know this, your listeners don't know this. My dad passed when I was a kid. I was a teenager when he died, and Hawaii has always felt so connected to him for me. And it was very connective there, but it also brought up a like new layer of grief to work through while I was there. And that just felt so Pisces and Saturn, like this connection to the other side, to the emotionality of grief and it being brought back up. Also, Saturn is like the father in so
I
many
was
ways.
just about to say, isn't Saturn the father?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it was a beautiful experience. You know, it was not like the relaxing laying on the beach the whole time Maui trip that I thought I was going to have, but it was exactly what I needed. And I still absolutely loved it. So yeah, that was my experience on my Saturn line. Okay. So we just have the outer planets left. So Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. Neptune lines are absolutely fascinating to me. I love Neptune lines. When we're on a Neptune line, we're brought so much deeper into our connection to spirituality, into interconnectedness and mysticism in general. The concepts around mysticism, as far as like the esotericism, the ethereal pieces of it, we just kind of like live within this soup when we're around a Neptune line. But there's also such a deep focus around our empathy and our compassion, around healing, around connectivity between people and relationships. There's a huge draw towards artistry and creativity around a Neptune line too. It's kind of like the evolutionary astrologers consider Neptune to be like the higher octave of Venus. So, like the connections that Venus brings around, or the themes that Venus brings around connection and creativity and artistry, Neptune does this, but on kind of like a higher level in terms of how we're able to conceptualize that within like a spiritual context and around our interconnectivity. And so, Neptune lines are a wonderful place to like go and retreat, to go and like tune in to your spirituality, to go on a yoga retreat, to like be within an artistic creative space. And Neptune line is so good for. Uranus lines bring in the unexpected. Uranus lines are liberating. And so it can feel really different, especially with Uranus based off of what angle it's on. A lot of people, when they're on a Uranus ascendant line, feel really good because it's all about self-liberation and how you know yourself and how you own your own unique voice and like move within your own unique path versus it being your descendant. It might feel more destabilizing, or you might experience more of that coming up as far as conflict within relationship when you're needing to be in this space of liberation, but it's coming through the dynamic of partnership, right? So like a Uranus descendant line, I see people get divorced on these lines. I see people create a new life for themselves because they realize that what they've been engaging with isn't actually fulfilling them and that they need to bring in new energy, that there needs to be this like sense of liberation that comes. So Uranus really is about liberation. It's also about doing things in an alternative way or in a different way. And so that is what comes up a lot around Uranus lines as well, is like being seen as an outsider or just doing things differently, being a voice of a different perspective, taking in information and being able to share it in a different way or utilizing it in a different way. What I also see that's so common with Uranus midheaven lines in particular is like entrepreneurism, setting off on a new career, creating that for yourself, having a completely random career shift. Like somebody travels to a Uranus midheaven line and they randomly meet someone who gives them a job offer that like literally changes the course of their entire career, like brings them into a new career path. And it's just this kind of like split second moment of change. It's like just this initiation and like this swiftness of the change is so Uranian.
Wait, and we also have to mention, Caitlin, too, that you were born on your Uranus line and you live, I mean, you still live close to it, right?
I still live on my Uranus line. I've lived on my Uranus line my entire life, which is not common. Typically, people will be on their Uranus line only for a little bit, like only until they experience what needs to be liberated, and then they leave and go integrate that somewhere else. I've always lived on my Uranus line. I've lived in like four different places on my Uranus line. So, like, that sense of restlessness is so there. But yeah, I've lived on it forever. Also, something that I want to say just about proximity of lines before I share more about my experience with my Uranus line is that you're experiencing the energy of that line up to about 500 miles outside of it. So even if your line isn't going directly through a space, that doesn't mean that you're not still experiencing that energy. It's just going to be slightly lessened. And the closer you get to the line, the more impactful that energy is. I would say like 200 miles out, you're like in a more distant radius, you're still feeling it, but it's not as heavy hitting. Once you're within 100 miles of the line, like you're really in that energy. I've my Uranus line runs straight down the middle of California and then like goes off the coast of LA. And so I've always been really close to my Uranus line. And yeah, it so brought that liberation. I mean, I'm an astrologer. Astrology and Uranus are so interconnected. But I do a bunch of different forms of like alternative healing modalities. That's something that is not something that I learned within my family or that was like normalized within my family, right?
That's
Like
like the very opposite of your family. Sorry to
100.
interrupt you, but we
No,
were
you're
talking
good.
about this before we actually started recording, is that like that is so out of like left field for someone from Caitlin's family. And also
Yeah.
your Uranus is your midheaven in the ninth house, which is and your midheaven is opposite of like where you come from with your family and everything. So like Caitlin's midheaven is like, okay, it's different from what I came from, shakes things up, is like kind of weird and outsidery. And then also it's in teaching too. So she
Yeah.
teaches this, strange modality, I guess you could say.
Yes, all of those pieces are so they're all a part of the story of it, right? Like if we were just looking at Uranus as a surface value and not looking at the rest of my chart, we wouldn't get that whole picture of it. I've personally have loved living on my Uranus line. I definitely feel the restlessness with it. I'm always feeling kind of restless though. I'm a Gemini. Like I want to
Mhm.
travel and go and do and explore. So um yeah, I think all of that's going to be there in some capacity for me, but it's been super liberating and expanding in the sense of being able to set different parameters for myself within my work and my career, knowing that I'm in charge of how that's coming through for me. Anyway, that's the Uranus line. Lots of change, transformation, liberation, letting go of things that have been holding you back, letting go of old stories and old identities, moving into new arenas of life that you probably didn't even have on your radar before. Like Uranus stuff usually tends to be pretty, like it feels really random when it's happening, and then afterwards, you're like, oh, actually, it makes complete sense. And here's the through line and all of these pieces. But when you're moving through it, you're just kind of like, what's going on? Like, why did I just get put into like this universal shaker and my life is shaken up and now I have to like reintegrate? Pluto lines are tricky. Pluto lines, we're dealing with a dynamic of power, personal power, external power, how we engage with that. Of course, again, the angle is going to really depend on where you're playing with the idea of power and where that's coming through. Generally, like generally speaking, Pluto lines are pretty unpleasant. I do my best to steer people away from their Pluto lines as much as possible, which isn't to say you shouldn't go and experience it, but like that's not a place that you're probably going to want to live.
Okay, so South Island of New Zealand is not where I'm
Oh,
going. Good to know.
what a bummer.
Well,
Well, you
North
should
Island, it's
still
fine.
go and
Actually, I should probably avoid most of New Zealand. That's okay.
it's going to be active there for sure.
Yeah.
You should still go and experience it, but that might be the kind of thing, like, especially with travel. I don't know, maybe it's going to be a little more challenging going through customs there. You know what I mean? Like, there's just that different dynamic that's played out within power and its dynamic and how we play with that. It also can be a place that's super uplifting of our personal power. So again, it depends on like where it's coming through. And if you have other lines running through that space that can kind of uplift it, it might feel better. For example, one of my Pluto lines runs straight through the US. And then I have a Jupiter and a Venus line line that connects to it. I haven't traveled to where they all connect, but I'm super curious to go because I know that that dynamic is going to be so different there than like a little bit further north where my Pluto line is just like hanging out in the middle of the country and it doesn't have that support from Jupiter and Venus as well. But Pluto lines are intense. JFK was assassinated on his Pluto line. Definitely like in
Wait,
terms,
because Pluto has to do with death.
yeah, dude, and power,
Why
right?
are we not looking into that conspiracy?
Next
An
podcast.
astrologer killed JFK. We have the answer. Forget Umbrella Man.
We're gonna Umbrella Man. That's our next episode. I love it so much. But totally, like it's that dynamic of death and not just like the idea of power and authority, but like physical dominance and power being wielded or being forced on you as well. So like I don't know, a really typical example of a Pluto line experience that I heard was like someone being mugged around their Pluto line. And it being an experience of somebody literally wielding power over you and playing into that dynamic in whatever way that's coming forward, you know? So it doesn't necessarily need to be violent, but
But it
speaking
probably
on,
will be, is what you're saying.
it like can be. It can be. It could also be a place where, like, I don't know if you own a business, being on a Pluto line could be a place where you connect to that sense of power and authority really clearly and well, and where you're able to establish that. But it also could be a place where your authority is challenged by other people and where you have to stand your ground more, or where you have to really like play into that dynamic and kind of redefine what that's looking like for you. So yeah, that's the Pluto line. We also will, you'll see on the chart, like you can have a Chiron line. You'll also see North Node lines. Chiron's an asteroid. I feel like we probably talked about Chiron on your podcast before, but I just wanted to give that gentle background in case we hadn't, because you're not always going to see Chiron when you're pulling up a chart since it is an asteroid. But Chiron is the wounded healer. And so when we're on a Chiron line, there's a handful of ways this can manifest. Sometimes I'll intentionally place people around a Chiron line if they have intentions to go somewhere specifically for healing, if they're going on a healing retreat, or maybe they've recently been through a massive loss and they want to take space to just like recoup and be with themselves. If that's the case, I'll try to find Chiron where it's supported by like the moon and something else to give it a different flavor as well. But Chiron can be so supportive for that because it brings us into our process of healing and to looking at and being with the wounds that we carry so that we can integrate them, we can move through them, we can heal with them. On the flip side of this, being on a Chiron line can also be the, I don't know, I don't want to say like lower or higher, but kind of like the lower manifestation of Chiron, where it might be where we are receiving the wounding, or that's like amplifying certain traumas. So I've seen this mostly with people who are younger living around their Chiron line. And I think that that just has to do with the themes of wounding with Chiron being most present when we're kids, because that's when we're picking up that wounding in whatever way it's coming through for us. But that can also be a more challenging line to be around, depending on what else is interacting within your chart and where Chiron is in your chart. But then the North Node line, this is one of my absolute favorite lines. The North Node line is beautiful. Being around your North Node line is always going to be bringing you further into your purpose, what you're built for, what you're here for, what your soul is evolving towards and learning in this lifetime. When we're on a North Node line, typically this is when we have experiences that feel really fated, where like you are out and about and you meet the right people who bring you the right opportunities, whether that is relationally, within your work, within your home life. Again, that's going to come through differently depending on the angle. It's like what it is that our soul is hungering for, learning and creating more of and evolving towards. It's almost like there's a magnet like drawing that out and just uplifting us when we're around the North Node line. And so it's a really potent and beautiful place to be too. Of course, like one of the most potent and beautiful places to be. I've also been given the feedback that it can be really intense to be on your North Node line for a long time. I personally think that that has a lot more to do with where that person's North Node was in their chart and like where it's hitting, what energy that is. For me, my North Node's in Scorpio. So like being on a North Node line for me is going to be super scorpionic, right? Like there's going to be that theme of transformation and rebirth and death and going into the depths of things. And that might not be something that like feels good all the time. It doesn't need to feel good all the time, but like that feeling is going to be so different than somebody who has their North Node in a Venusian sign like Libra or Taurus, where the focus is so much more on like, oh, do you really?
Yeah, my North Node is in Libra.
Oh my God. And
For the
yourself.
first time ever, I've been happy to know that my North Node is in Libra because I would have loved to have my North Node in Aries, where I'm like, it's all about me, bitch. Forget the rest of you. It's
Well, you already
about
did that.
me.
Your South Node is there, so like you've already done that.
I've done it. Yeah, it's time for me to grow up a little bit.
Yeah.
But Caitlin, this is so cool. And for anybody listening, I know that a lot of this sounds complex. Like it's so fun. Caitlin and I were at a picnic the other day and we were talking to each other and to the people around us. They're like, I never know what's going on. like we were chatting and someone near us was just like, I don't understand any of it. You look like you're having a great time, but I don't understand any of this. And so sometimes, this can be a lot. And if you want this stuff explained to you in a really understandable way that's really personalized to you, Caitlin does astrocartography readings, and I've gotten one myself, and they're so eye-opening and so amazing. And you can ask her whatever questions you want about where you should go, and it'll be very personalized to what you want out of an experience of where you're living or where you're traveling to. And I highly recommend it. I think it is so eye-opening.
Yeah, it's so much fun. Honestly, like I have had so much more fun doing astrocartography than I have any other kind of astrology session in the last couple of years. Like it just combines my passion for travel and for the world and astrology into one thing. But also, like, why would I not want to use this insanely helpful tool to plan my travels? Whether I'm like just looking to have a calm, chill vacation, whether I want to be really intentional about a place I'm going or a trip I'm taking, or if I'm like intending to relocate, this is one of the most useful tools I think of all time to find that. And it's been so cool and getting to do sessions with people like you and other people who have traveled pretty significantly to be able to reflect on what their experiences were like in different lines. And sometimes it's just affirmation around like, oh yeah, like I did not feel good there and did not understand why, or understanding why you were drawn to a certain place, or even just the timing of it, because sometimes the timing is huge as far as when and where we're pulled in a certain direction, or when's a great time to go somewhere else in the world. So it's so fun. And we can do these readings kind of like more generally, like you're saying, like just asking questions and talking about it. Or I've been very, also very specific with some consultations I've given, where if someone has had really strong intentions around what they're wanting to bring forward in their lives, we're able to get super, super clear on where that can happen best and most easily for them, which is just so awesome.
And you're awesome, Caitlin. You rock. To everyone else listening, you rock. And I will talk to you next time.